Happy Halloween. It's time to discuss the hypocritical media hysteria surrounding the Obama administration's feud with Fox News. The media has been using words like Nixonian, and some have even controversially asserted that this is some assault on freedom of the press. However, this pales in comparison to various genuine assaults on press freedom, freedom of speech, and others that occurred under the Bush administration, and some of which continue under the Obama administration. But does the media care about that? Of course not. They only care when one of their own, a corporate news outlet, is attacked, rather than when genuine coercion is utilized by the government to subvert freedom of the press, or when they use deceptive tactics in order to turn the mainstream media into a government mouthpiece for warmongering. After the Obama administration criticized Fox News and refused to arrange them a press conference, well, really it was 5 minutes for each network to interview one of their officials, they weren't going to let Fox be part of it. Now, Fox News called this Nixonian and compared it to various policies of press repression and compared it to Nixon's enemies list. Similarly, conservative commentator Tucker Carlson claimed that Obama was bullying Fox News and that the White House were trying to use government power to muzzle opinions they don't agree with. And he righteously condemned the press corps' shameful silence and that hardly anyone in the press said a word about the matter. Those are all quotes from him. Now, of course, it's not the case that hardly anyone in the press said a word about the matter. The mainstream media reacted with hysteria. They refused to do this interview unless Fox News was allowed a slot, and so Fox News was allowed a slot. The media was willing to fight the White House on behalf of one of their fellow corporate media outlets. Let's see how well they've done on protecting things that genuinely pertain to freedom of the press, rather than simply being the White House engaging in criticism and deciding with whom they will do press conferences. I've never seen anyone in the White House, for instance, do a press conference with Amy Goodman or with Reason Magazine or anything of the sort. These are legitimate news outlets, but they happen to be left-wing or libertarians, so does this mean that the White House is engaged in freedom of the press and suppression of such, or not? I wouldn't assert that. Anyway, another interesting quote. Karl Rove said, "We heard this before from Richard Nixon, and we have this White House prone to that kind of attitude. This is the White House engaging in its own version of the enemies list." The Washington Post wrote editorials about this. CNN's Anderson Cooper said, "This White House is starting to look like another White House," in reference to Nixon. I mean, all of these media people are just going after Obama over this. Did they have this same attitude towards genuine restrictions of press freedom? The answer to the question, does the media express this kind of fervent outrage when genuine violations of freedom of the press emerge, is plainly no. Let us examine a few of the examples. For instance, the Bush administration explicitly threatened to prosecute New York Times journalists for reporting on Bush's illicit spying program, his illegal surveillance of American citizens. They also refused to allow New York Times journalists on their airplanes. I mean, this attack on the New York Times is genuine suppression of press freedom. If we're talking about the sort of thing that Obama has been doing, the Bush White House engaged in plenty of criticism of NBC, particularly MSNBC, noted for their anti-Bush commentators such as Keith Olbermann. Did that prompt the kind of severe reaction that we're getting to this critique of Fox? Not that I recall. Not that I recall at all. It gets even worse when we consider their treatment of foreign journalists. Starting in 2001, the United States government held a cameraman for the news network Al Jazeera. This cameraman was Sami al-Hajj for 6 years in Guantanamo Bay prison. Rather than spending that time interrogating him with inquiries regarding terrorism, they interrogated him about Al Jazeera, a legitimate journalistic news network. Without due process, he was imprisoned. Without habeas corpus rights, he was imprisoned. He was a journalist, not a terrorist. He was not even suspected of being a terrorist. As Nicholas Kristof reported when al-Hajj was finally released in 2007, there was never any real evidence that Sami was anything but a journalist. He pointed out that the interrogators quickly gave up on asking him substantive questions and stated that instead they asked him to spy on Al Jazeera if he was released. So, in other words, the United States government imprisoned a journalist and attempted to get him to monitor a legitimate news network on their behalf. Where were the media protests of this? Why did the media not refuse to engage in discourse with the Bush administration until Sami was released? Might it be because they only care about their fellow network news colleagues? Might it be that we really don't have a liberal media, but rather a right-wing media? Similarly, in Iraq, we imprisoned Associated Press photographer Bilal Hussein for almost 2 years without filing a single charge against him. This was because his photographs from the Anbar province contradicted Bush administration claims regarding the state of affairs. The Committee to Protect Journalists documented that Hussein's detention is not an isolated incident. Over the last 3 years, dozens of journalists, primarily Iraqis, have been detained by United States troops, according to CPJ research. While most have been released after short periods, at least 8 cases documented by CPJ Iraqi journalists Iraqi journalists have been held by U.S. forces for weeks or months without charge or conviction. In one highly publicized case, Abdul Amir Yunus Hussein, a freelance cameraman working for CBS, was detained after being wounded by U.S. military fire as he filmed clashes in Mosul in northern Iraq on April 5, 2005. U.S. military officials claimed footage in his camera led them to suspect Hussein had prior knowledge of attacks on coalition forces. In April 2006, a year after his arrest, Hussein was freed after an Iraqi criminal court, citing a lack of evidence, acquitted him of collaborating with insurgents. Even worse, the United States continues to imprison journalist Ibrahim Jassam, who is a freelance photographer for Reuters. However, an Iraqi court last December found that there was no evidence whatsoever to justify his detention and ordered the United States to release him. However, over the objections of CPJ, Reporters Without Borders, and Reuters, the United States refused to recognize the validity of that Iraqi court order. We continue to imprison him. Why? Why has the media not covered this story? Why is it that they are not refusing to engage with the administration until this man is released? Furthermore, media control is not simply limited to attacks on journalists. Sometimes it takes the form of planting people as though they are legitimate sources who are really propagandists. I speak, of course, of the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalism piece that was published in the New York Times a while ago, and which my left Boston colleague, Sarah, reported on a Monday, which involves the fact that all of the major news networks took on as military experts, military analysts, various people who were simply Pentagon shills, most of whom were on the boards of military contracting companies. That was not within the code of journalistic ethics. They were not even represented as though they were on the board. They were treated as independent military analysts. Yet this story was completely unreported by the mainstream news media because, of course, all the major news networks were complicit. This is what's wrong with America. We can get into a hysterical fit about Nixonian repression when a mainstream news outlet faces some criticism from the White House. But when the White House and the executive branch manipulate the media, or when they explicitly coerce journalists in a manner that is truly reminiscent of totalitarianism, we are silent. Where are your priorities, my friends? Where is the media when we need them?